All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into uh,
Radical Markets?
radical
That's a
markets.
book by Eric Posner and Glen Weyl, and it's a book that really kind of um, takes on a lot of the foundational assumptions of our current political and economic lives, and sort of puts forward some very bold proposals for kind of rethinking a lot of things to address inequality and stagnation and sort of the social conflicts that we're seeing all around us.
Yeah, and I think one of the most provocative things about the book is that their starting point is, that markets are fundamentally the best way to organize society,
Hmm.
but that the markets that we have now are often rigged or missing altogether. And so they're trying to think about, well, what would it look like to create genuinely, open and competitive and free markets in the fullest sense? And they also have sort of a lineage of thought here. Like they specifically credit Sumaya Keynes for her enthusiasm early on in the project. And they also recognize a lot of their collaborators who sort of helped them along the way, like Anthony Lee Zhang, whose work on common ownership is sort of, the genesis of a lot of their ideas, and also Steve Lally and Nick Stephanopoulos, Fiona Scott Morton, and Jaron Lanier, all kind of pushing the boundaries in the way we think about markets and society.
Yeah, you can really see those intellectual threads throughout the book. So, for instance, this concept of the common ownership self-assessed tax, or KOFT, which we're going to talk about later, that really grew out of Weyl's work with Anthony Lee Zhang, and their notion of quadratic voting, which is this kind of fascinating way to think about making political choices. That grew out of work with Steve Lally, and then was extended to think about election law with Nick Stephanopoulos. So there's this real kind of confluence of these different ideas.
And so let me kind of bring this into your world for a minute. You think about a major city like Rio de Janeiro, which is where the book kind of opens, struggling with huge gaps in wealth, a stagnant economy, and social unrest kind of simmering beneath the surface. I mean, doesn't that resonate with the challenges that we're seeing in a lot of big cities globally? Is that just the way it has to be?
Yeah, that's the powerful question that Posner and Weyl pose right at the start of the book.
Hmm.
They're saying, is this cycle inevitable, or can urban centers and societies find a better path? And their argument is it's not about a shortage of resources, it's really about a shortage of fresh thinking. And they're suggesting that the standard solutions from both the left and the right maybe had some merit in the past,
Yeah.
but aren't really cutting it anymore.
Yeah. And the book kind of proposes some pretty radical overhauls of our systems. And a key tool they propose using is something you might not immediately expect: auctions. They actually propose that auction mechanisms applied in innovative ways could provide some very surprising answers to some of these very deep-seated problems like economic inequality and even political corruption.
That's right. And so it's worth starting by thinking about what exactly they mean by a radical market. And in their words, a radical market is institutional arrangements that allow the fundamental principles of market allocation, free exchange, disciplined by competition, and open to all comers, to play out fully. And they see the auction as a kind of quintessential example of this principle in action. It's a place where bidding, reveals how much someone truly values something.
Right, because in theory, the act of bidding against other people means that whatever is being sold ends up going to the person who values it the most. Now, obviously, they acknowledge here that, obviously how much someone can bid is going to be influenced by how much wealth they have.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They propose this kind of crazy sounding idea that a system of continuous auctions could actually be the key to dismantling the main driver of economic inequality.
Yeah.
Right? Your first thought might be, well, wouldn't the rich just snap up everything? But think about what it means to be wealthy, right? To be wealthy usually means to control significant assets,
Right.
right? So businesses, land, intellectual property, and so on.
I think I'm starting to follow the logic. If everything is constantly being auctioned, no one could just kind of sit on their assets indefinitely.
That's right.
And the advantages of owning those assets would, in theory, then kind of be much more broadly spread as ownership changes hands more frequently.
Exactly. And so it's this very fluid picture of ownership. Then they take this radical auction idea and extend it into the realm of politics. So imagine a Rio-style auction system, not for, physical goods, but for the power to influence political decisions. And they argue that this could actually be a way to curb corruption. By shifting major decisions away from politicians who are susceptible to lobbying and, kind of backroom deals and into the hands of citizens based on, how much they value a particular outcome.
So it's almost like creating a market for political influence.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, So how would this actually lead to improvements in our daily lives? I mean, they talk about some pretty significant potential benefits.
Yeah, they suggest that under a system like this, you might see less crime, you might see a revitalization of public spaces,
Hmm.
and less of an inclination for people to retreat into these kind of private, secure communities. The idea is that by giving citizens this kind of more direct market-based way to shape public decisions, it could actually build trust in the public sphere rather than erode it, which is often a concern with these kind of market-based solutions.
So where did these concepts originate? Are these brand new, or are they sort of building on some historical and intellectual underpinnings?
They definitely have deep roots.
Hmm.
And Posner and Weyl specifically highlight William Vickery as a kind of major inspiration. They even call him the quiet hero behind radical markets.
Yeah.
Now, his name might not be a household name, but he won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1996
Ah,
for his pioneering work on auctions and something called mechanism design, which is essentially the science of designing effective rules for markets and decision-making processes.
so the Nobel Prize definitely adds some weight to the discussion. What was it about Vickery's work that particularly resonated with Posner and Weyl?
So one of the fascinating things here is that Vickery's research interests were very much aligned with the kinds of problems that Posner and Weyl are tackling. He was really interested in how cities work and the kinds of inefficiencies he saw in urban planning and management. He spent a lot of time thinking about Latin American cities. He even advised governments there on things like taxation. And it was actually during his work designing a fiscal system for Venezuela that he wrote this really important paper back in 1961 called Counter-Speculation, Auctions, and Competitive Sealed Tenders.
That does not exactly sound like a must-read uh, type.
So you're right, it wasn't an instant hit, but it was kind of rediscovered a decade later, and it's now considered foundational in the field of mechanism design. And so Vickery's work really laid the groundwork for understanding how auctions could be used to address these major societal challenges by revealing people's true valuations for things.
So Vickery's ideas weren't just theoretical. Did they actually have any real-world impact?
Absolutely, his ideas have been incredibly influential. So think about how governments sell licenses to use radio frequencies, right? Those spectrum auctions that happen all around the world, those often use principles that Vickery developed. Even the way that Facebook and Google and Bing sell advertising space on their websites
Okay.
is based on auction mechanisms that are derived from his work. And his ideas also inform strategies for urban congestion pricing, and even the dynamic pricing that's used by ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft.
Wow, so pretty big impact.
Yeah.
So besides Vickery, did they draw inspiration from any other thinkers?
Yes, they deliberately look back at this group that they call the philosophical radicals and political economists of the late 18th and 19th centuries.
Okay.
So think about thinkers like Adam Smith and Condorcet, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Henry George, Leon Walras, Beatrice Webb. These were the intellectual giants who really shaped our understanding of modern market economies and liberal democracies.
That's interesting that they're looking back to these historical figures for answers to modern day problems. What kind of parallels do they see between then and now?
I think one of the striking things is that even though they lived in a very different era, these thinkers grappled with surprisingly similar issues. So things like rapid technological change, shifts in population, the early stages of globalization, and really deeply entrenched privilege that was hindering progress on equality and reform. And their goal, much like Posner and Weyl, was really to find new ways of thinking, to move society forward. And their ideas often combine what we would now think of as kind of right-leaning libertarian ideas with kind of left-leaning egalitarian goals. It's almost like they were tapping into this kind of shared intellectual inheritance that both sides of our current political spectrum have drawn from.
So let's move to the present day. Why do they believe that our current systems are kind of falling short?
Well, they point to some pretty compelling evidence. For example, they highlight the really significant increase in economic profits that are attributable to monopoly power in the United States since the 1980s. These are profits above and beyond what you'd expect in a genuinely competitive market, and they've risen really sharply, coinciding with growing inequality and a shrinking share of national income going to workers. And so they argue that this rich get richer dynamic, as they call it, is overwhelmingly benefiting those at the very top.
And they connect this economic reality to the rise of particularly right-wing populist movements, don't they?
That's right. They argue that this kind of economic discontent creates very fertile ground for right-wing populist movements that often appeal to a sense of national identity and this kind of longing for a perceived past where certain groups felt more secure economically and had higher social standing.
We've seen a lot of that sentiment in recent years, for sure, but they're also pretty critical of those movements too.
Yes, they point out that while these movements effectively highlight some of the very real problems with our current systems, they often lack practical policy solutions that would actually benefit their own supporters or society as a whole. And so they argue that in a way, the rise of these movements is a symptom of democratic institutions failing to serve the public interest and failing to resolve conflicts between different social groups.
They also talk about the historical context of markets and how they compare to earlier forms of social organization.
That's right. They contrast what they call the moral economies of the past, where you had these tight-knit communities
Mm.
who relied on social norms and empathy and even religious beliefs to promote the common good. They contrast that with our kind of self-interest-driven modern markets that were famously described by Adam Smith.
Mm.
Right? So in these earlier moral economies, self-interested behavior was often seen as a negative. It was seen as a flaw rather than as this virtue that would lead to prosperity.
So what about the main alternative to markets? What about central planning?
Yeah, they acknowledge that central planning ultimately proved to be a failure. But so, for instance, the Soviet Union, while achieving some industrial and military advancements, really struggled to meet the diverse needs and preferences of individual consumers. And this led to shortages and inefficiencies. And so their argument is that, the market, despite its imperfections, doesn't really have a viable large-scale alternative for organizing economies.
So if markets are the answer,
Right.
what are the kind of essential ingredients for a well-functioning market, in their opinion?
They boil it down to three key principles:
Okay.
freedom, competition, and openness. So freedom to participate in market exchange, strong competition to prevent monopolies and ensure fair pricing, and openness meaning that participation isn't restricted by things like nationality or gender or other categories that aren't relevant to people's ability to participate in the market.
That makes sense. They give some pretty compelling examples of the power of open markets.
They do. So think about how opening markets to international trade brought pasta to Italy, or how opening labor markets to women has brought their skills and perspectives into boardrooms. Yeah. Even the explosion of smartphone apps is a result of opening the market to a wide range of developers. And so the idea is that, broader cooperation leads to greater benefits for everyone.
It's interesting they also revisit Adam Smith's work, and they highlight a less commonly discussed argument that he made.
Yeah, they point to an earlier work by Smith, where he argued that in a well-functioning market, the wealthy are almost, quote, led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants. And so they emphasize that this potential for markets to actually promote a relatively equal distribution of basic necessities is often overlooked in contemporary discussions.
So how do we go from that to this stagnequality, the combination of economic sedation and rising inequality that they're talking about?
They trace it back to the post-World War II era, which was a period of really significant economic growth and reduced inequality that was fueled by liberal reforms. And so this success led to this kind of widespread belief that we had more or less achieved perfect markets.
Yeah.
And so the focus shifted away from things like further expanding trade or actively tackling monopoly power. And economists increasingly attributed inequality primarily to differences in inherent talents, with the assumption that progressive taxation and welfare programs could take care of issues of fairness without really significantly hindering overall economic growth.
And so this ultimately led to a fracturing of the liberal consensus, didn't it?
Exactly. So you had those who prioritized equality kind of becoming the modern left, and those who prioritized free markets becoming the modern right. And while both sides had some successes, think about things like the civil rights movement or, further expansions of international trade. At the same time, inequality within wealthy nations began to rise and economic growth began to slow down. And it's this stagnequality, this simultaneous stagnation and rising inequality that they really see as the fundamental driver of our current political divisions.
So they don't see the stagnequality as just some inevitable consequence of these global forces.
No, they very much see it as a failure of ideas. They argue that both the left and the right have failed to adequately address some of the fundamental tensions that exist within capitalism and democracy. So this kind of inherent power that comes with private property.
Correct.
And the limitations of a one-person, one-vote system in protecting minority interests. These are the kinds of core issues that they feel haven't been properly addressed.
They also talk about some very practical inefficiencies in our existing markets.
Yes. So they highlight the inefficiencies in strategic behaviors, like what they call holdout risk, that plague a lot of market transactions, particularly complex deals. So think about land development. If you're trying to assemble multiple adjacent properties to build a factory, individual landowners can hold out for really inflated prices, potentially delaying or even preventing the entire project.
And they also point out that there are crucial areas where markets are simply missing altogether.
Exactly. So they cite the severe restrictions on cross-border labor migration as a significant missing market, as well as the absence of a genuine market for personal data, which is largely collected and monetized by tech companies with little or no direct compensation to the users who are generating it.
So basically, their argument is that our supposedly, perfectly competitive market economy is actually riddled with all of these impaired and absent markets.
That's the core of it. And they argue that by confronting this reality head on, we can actually move beyond the kind of current left-right polarization
Yeah.
and revitalize the fight against prejudice and privilege by truly embracing and expanding the power of well-designed markets.
So to summarize, I mean, it's a very compelling and ambitious vision. What would you say is the kind of main takeaway from this initial exploration of radical markets?
Well, I think the fundamental idea is that by strategically using and expanding market mechanisms, especially auctions, we can actually tackle some of our most entrenched societal problems, issues of inequality and inefficiency
Yeah.
in both our economies and our political systems.
And they seem pretty optimistic that these radical ideas could lead to a much better future.
Yes, they are hopeful that by embracing these principles, we can boost overall prosperity, significantly reduce inequality, and even foster greater compromise across the political spectrum. Moving beyond those traditional left-right divides that seems so firmly entrenched today.
Well, it definitely gives us a lot to think about. And on that note, here's a final thought for you. As we've been talking about these ideas of continuous valuation and the right to bid that are so central to these auction-based systems, I want you to think about how these ideas might actually fundamentally change our understanding of ownership itself. Could it be that in a radical market's future, the distinction between truly owning something and kind of intensely renting it becomes increasingly blurry? What implications might that kind of shift have on individual behavior and the very structure of our societies? It's a question worth pondering well after this deep dive concludes. Thanks for joining us.